This is God's word.
You may be seated. Thank you, Madeline. Well, friends, it's great to be with you this morning. My name is Charlie Dunn, and this last week, I was out of town for a few days, had the chance to spend some time with a group of pastors. I'm in a covenant group with some other pastors that are part of our same denomination, and we meet throughout the year, but we try to meet in person at least one time during the year, and that's a group with whom I seek accountability, and we try to encourage one another in our own walks with Jesus and in our own family life and how we're leading as pastors within each of our churches. And I have to say that coming back from that time, I not only was encouraged, but I came back feeling just immensely thankful to get to be your pastor, to get to follow Jesus together here in Lake Highlands as we live on mission together. And so I just want to say thank you for the privilege, for the gift that it really is to get to be your pastor. I mentioned about a week and a half ago that I attended this prayer breakfast in Lake Highlands over at the Lake Highlands YMCA, and the speaker at that breakfast was a guy by the name of Bob Brunig. Bob was a member of the Doomsday Defense on the Dallas Cowboys back in the 1970s. Some of you might remember those days. Those were the days, he said, when NFL football players had to work a second job in the offseason just to be able to pay their bills. Can you imagine that now? But Bob was a part of those Super Bowl winning Cowboys teams, and he was sharing about how he had become a follower of Jesus. And Bob said that for much of his earlier life, he did not feel like he needed God in his life. Bob had a lot of accolades. He had a lot of athletic awards and accomplishments. He thought to himself, why would I really need God in my life? And for him, the thing about the Christian faith that was most confusing was the cross. Because he thought to himself, nobody is perfect. Surely everybody needs a few sins to be forgiven. But why would it be necessary for nothing short of the excruciating death of God himself on a cross in order for my sins to be forgiven? He couldn't see his need for that. And for Bob, when he began his journey towards Jesus, what it was for him was this beginning to recognize the sin within his own heart. When he started to see what we've described the last few Sundays together as the God complex, this deep desire to want to be his own God, to want to run his life apart from the God who had made him and who longed to be in relationship with him, as he began to recognize some of the self-interest, the deep selfishness in his heart, is when he recognized his need for Jesus. When he saw the purpose of the cross. For Bob, it started with owning the reality of the bad news of our sin that allowed him then to embrace the good news of what Jesus had done for him in his death and in his resurrection. Now, that was true for Bob coming to faith in Jesus back in the 1970s. But I would suggest to you that's even more true for us today. One of the things we've talked about together over the last few weeks is that over the last few years, sin has gone out of vogue. Sin has gone out of fashion. Not that people are no longer engaging in or practicing sin, far from it, but the idea, the category of sin, the way of making sense of the brokenness in ourselves, the brokenness and misery that we see in the world, that idea of sin as a category has somewhat gone out of fashion. And so therefore, if we're going to be people who are able to make sense of what we believe as Christians, much less, as we've talked about in this series, if we're going to be able to share our faith with those who do not yet believe, it's pretty important that we be people then who are able to explain this idea of sin. And I know for some of you, maybe you think, Charlie, this is week 5 It's week 7 in our series, Faith You Can Explain, but it's the 5th straight week that we are talking about the doctrine of sin. And I would say take that up with the Apostle Paul because we're just following Romans 1 through 5. But it might feel like we're starting to hear a little bit of a broken record. Are we really talking about sin for yet another Sunday today? And I'll say it's the last Sunday before we move to the good news, before Paul shifts to that in Romans 3, verse 21. But it's pretty important if we're going to understand our faith, and if we're going to be able to explain it to others, that we have this really clear understanding of the doctrine of sin. And so in this passage that Madeline read for us, right at the end of this section of the book of Romans, you can imagine that Paul is kind of like a prosecuting attorney. He's been making his case against all the different groups of humans out there, right? He makes his case against godless pagans who don't acknowledge God and who chase their own pleasure and hedonism. He makes his case there. Then he turns to really good, moral, decent people who don't believe in God, and he makes his case for why being good is not good enough before God. Then he turns to the religious people, and he says, if you think you guys are getting off, that's not true. And he makes his case for why you can be a very religious person and yet still stand guilty before the judgment seat of God. And here in Romans 3, 9 through 20, Paul is making his closing argument. Right? He's standing before the court and he's arguing for why it is that all of humanity deserves a guilty verdict before the judgment seat of God. Paul says that every mouth will be stopped and held accountable before the judgment seat of God. And as Paul makes this closing argument, he really does so with 4 kind of key points that I want to walk through together. Here they are. First, Paul argues for the depth of our sin. Secondly, he argues for the breadth of our sin. Then he speaks of the direction of our sin. And then finally, what should be our right response to our sin. So we're going to walk through these 4 together. So here's the first. Paul argues for the depth of our sin. Look at what he says again in these verses. He says of humanity, he says, our throats are open graves. Our tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their feet are swift to shed blood, and ruin and misery mark their ways. The way of peace they do not know. Now, if you are living right now in the Ukraine, you might hear these words and they would resonate with you. You would think, yes, humanity is capable of this kind of evil. But for those of us who live in a fairly peaceful community and environment where that is less of our daily reality, I think we read this and we say, come on, Paul. I mean, come on, aren't you exaggerating a little for the sake of your argument? Are people really all this bad? I got to be honest with you, even viscerally for me, preparing to preach on this passage, I look at this and I think, Paul, can you just kind of tone it down? Right, Paul, people clearly aren't as bad as you are making them out to be. I've been studying the book of Romans for the last 16 years. 16 years ago is the first time I read this book. And even still, I read this and I think, are we really that bad? Paul, is that really a fair description of the human race? But, as I've studied this, what I've come to recognize is that Paul here, he is not saying that people are as bad as they possibly could be. He's not saying that, because you remember just a couple of weeks ago we looked in Romans chapter 2, where what does Paul say? He says that even people who don't acknowledge God, people who don't believe in God, can nevertheless live very moral and decent lives. They can live lives that are marked by generosity and love and morality. Right? Paul says that God's law is written on every human heart, and so therefore people can act in some good ways even who don't acknowledge or believe in God. So he's not saying that people are as bad as they possibly could be. But what the doctrine of our sin, the doctrine of total depravity means is that every part of our lives, our thinking, our desires, our behaviors, have all been affected by this way in which we are turned in on ourselves, how we want to rule and run our lives apart from God. Sin touches every part of our lives. And what Paul is saying is that there is a depth to our sin that we often fail to recognize or to see. And you see, the cash value of this, Paul is saying, is he's saying, look, you are going to be constantly surprised. You're not going to understand yourself, and you're not going to understand a lot of the brokenness and the misery that we see in the world around us or in other people until you come to terms with the depth of our sin. Back in the 1600s, there was a mathematician named Blaise Pascal. Anybody heard of Blaise Pascal before? He invented the calculator. Pretty significant. He came up with the foundations for mathematical probability. So if you've ever struggled through a statistics class at any point in your life, you have Blaise Pascal to thank for that. This guy was a genius. Physics, math, poetry. I think it's fair to say Blaise Pascal was probably smarter than anybody in this room here today. And Blaise Pascal was somebody who he took some offense. He was bothered by the doctrine of original sin. Bothered by some of what Paul is saying here about the depth of our sin. Listen to how he puts it. He says, nothing jolts us more rudely than this doctrine that we are all deeply flawed and self-interested. He says it jolts us. We don't like thinking of ourselves in that way. But then he goes on to say this. He says, but apart from this mystery of original sin, we remain incomprehensible to ourselves. He's saying you won't understand yourself until you come to terms with this doctrine. When you hear that people have defrauded the U.S. government of $100 billion from the payroll protection program, right? Exploiting the very funds that were meant to just help people keep their lives going in the midst of a global pandemic. When you hear that, you're going to be shocked. You're going to be surprised. When you hear that Russian soldiers are mutilating Ukrainian POWs or raping Ukrainian civilians. When you hear this kind of news, you're going to be shocked. You're going to be surprised. When you hear about yet another politician or pastor or teacher or policeman who exploit and abuse their power rather than using it to serve and lead those that they have been called to protect, you're going to be surprised when maybe somebody in your life that you thought you knew really well, it turns out they're leading a double life. Or somebody that you really trusted is unfaithful to you. They betray your trust. When you hear these sorts of things, even when you, like maybe King David, you remember King David? He was somebody who loved the Lord with all his strength. He wrote many of the Psalms in the Bible, a man after God's own heart. And yet when he found himself doing things that he never thought that he was capable of, right? Rape, murder, trying to cover it up. You're going to be incomprehensible to yourself. You're going to be shocked by the things that other people are capable of doing, and you're going to be shocked by the things that you are capable of doing, unless you come to terms with the depth of our sin. Some of you might know that Netflix recently released a new documentary, a TV show. It's called Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story. I don't know if any of you have watched that. I am not advocating that you watch that. I do not plan to watch that myself. But it's a documentary that is describing this serial killer and the ways that he exploited and abused and mistreated people in a lot of gory detail. The BBC said that it is a unwatchably queasy show because of the level of detail that it goes into. And for me, I think what's just kind of surprising or fascinating is that 185 million people tuned in for the very first episode of this show. And my question is why is that? Like, what draws us? What is fascinating? What is alluring about seeing such vile evil of which another human being is capable of? What sort of draws us to that? When I was in college, I read this book. I was in a European history class, and the book was called Ordinary Men. It's a really fascinating book. I've never forgotten it because the book talks about how during World War II, there was this group of ordinary German men who did not enlist to fight in the German military, who were not members of the Nazi Party. These guys didn't want to go to war. They wanted to stay home. They wanted to farm their lands. They wanted to be good husbands and good fathers and just to go about their ordinary lives as German citizens, but they were conscripted. They were forced to go and serve in what were known as the police battalions in Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe, these areas of land that Germany had conquered, and they needed police battalions to oversee them. And it's a really fascinating study because it talks about, here are these guys who initially they were really reticent to be there. Initially, they were really reticent to do some of the terrible things that were asked of them, but eventually they committed these incredible atrocities. They murdered over 2 million people in some pretty brutal and terrible ways. And the book is all about, how does that happen? How are ordinary people capable of that kind of evil? And I think for me, one of my takeaways from that book was to recognize the fact that even if not everybody ends up committing those kinds of atrocities, that put in the right circumstances, that put in the right conditions, that if you were to remove any threat of punishment, if you were to remove the restraining effects of the rule of law, if our self-interest were really put on the line, I think there's some sense in which all of us are capable of far greater evil than we might realize. And it's not just Jeffrey Dahmer, that there's a monster inside of every single one of us, the depth of human sin. Now, maybe you hear that and you think to yourself, that's a fair description of some people, right? That's a fair description of people like the Jeffrey Dahmers or the Adolf Hitlers of the world. Certainly there are some really bad people, and they have this depth of evil that they are capable of. But maybe where you struggle is to think, is that really true of all of humanity? We can accept the depth of sin in some people, but I think we have a much harder time accepting the breadth of that sin. The idea that is a fair description of all of humanity, really of every human heart. But listen to what Paul says in verses 9 through 12. Here's how he puts it. He says, all alike are under the power of sin. Then he goes so far as to say this. He says, there is none who is righteous, not even one. There is none who does good, not even one. And I think we hear that and we think to ourselves, Paul, have you ever heard of Mother Teresa? Right? She seemed like a pretty good person. She did a lot of good for people who were in need. Paul, are you really saying that before the judgment seat of God, Mother Teresa and Adolf Hitler are on level ground? Right? That before God's judgment seat, that Mother Teresa isn't on any better ground than Adolf Hitler. Paul, are you really saying that the person who is a criminal, who robs and who murders people, and the Pharisee, who's a pretty moral, decent person, and they just want God and other people to give them the respect that they think that they are owed, are you really saying that they are on equal terms before the judgment seat of God? Is that what you're really saying? Are you really saying that regardless of how it might look so different in people's behavior on the outside, that the human heart is so radically turned in on itself, that that's true of every single person who is alive or who has ever lived? Right? The breadth of sin. And I think we resist that, don't we? We look at the world, and how do we want to divide it? We want to divide it up between the good people and the bad people, the good people like us, and then these other bad people. That's our instinctual response to human evil. Just think about the soldiers who came to liberate the death camps in Nazi Germany. So American soldiers, American GIs who came in to liberate these death camps, and as they were trying to come to terms with the atrocities that they saw, right, over 6 million Jewish people exterminated. And along with them, hundreds of thousands of people with mental and physical disabilities, people who were considered a drain on the German economy, who were exterminated. As they tried to come to terms with these atrocities, a number of them were interviewed afterwards. And you want to know what they said? As they were trying to make sense of this, they said, there must be something about those German people. There must be something about Japanese people that would make them capable of committing these kinds of things, because we Americans would never do something like that. We would never be capable of that kind of evil. See, that's the instinct. We want to divide the world up in that way. But can I tell you the problem with that? The moment that you do that, the moment that you say, well, there's something inherently evil about those people, if we could just get rid of those people, what you do is you actually make yourself liable to commit the very same kind of atrocities as what took place in something like the Holocaust. Because you begin to think, well, we can justify this behavior. That's what the Soviets said. They said, if we can just get rid of those capitalist sort of people. Right? Or that's what the Nazis said. If we can just get rid of those Jews, or we can get rid of those capitalists, then, right, the world will be a better place. You actually, when you divide the world up in that way, you make yourself liable to thinking the problem is that group of people. If we could just get rid of them. One of the people who really came to understand the breadth of human sin was a guy by the name of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Anybody heard of him before? He was imprisoned in a Russian gulag, one of the work camps in Siberia, very unjustly, very unfairly during the time of the Soviet rule in Russia. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn said he was living in this Russian work camp, and he said that one of the ways that you are able to survive when you're in a Russian gulag is, he says, when you're being tortured by prison guards and by oppressive people, one of the ways you keep your sanity is, he says, you sit around and you fantasize about what would it be like if you were to get power over the very people who were tormenting you. He says, what would it be like if I were in power over these prison guards? And he says one day he was fantasizing about what he would do if he got out of there, if he got into power. He says, I began to fantasize about picking up these guards and throwing them down into the pit. The problem is, he said, as I stood before the pit, I was suddenly stricken down, and I realized it's just the way things worked out, that I'm the victim and that they're the oppressor. But he said if things were switched, he could just as easily be the oppressor instead of the victim. See, he recognized something about the sin within his own heart, and he wrote these words. These are very famous words. He said, the line dividing good from evil runs through the middle of every human heart. In other words, we want to make the line between this group of people and this group of people. He says, no, the line dividing good and evil runs through the middle of every human heart. And can you imagine what a better world this would be if people actually believed that? What a better world it would be if we believed in the doctrine of original sin. You know, sometimes people might think, gosh, if you believe people are this sinful and this capable of evil, you're going to have a very negative view of other human beings. Actually, quite the opposite. Imagine how much better the world would be. Right? Because instead of the Germans, you know, in the 1920s, when things were very depressed in Germany, instead of them thinking to themselves, gosh, it's the Jews' fault, it's the capitalists' fault, it's those people's fault, maybe they would think to themselves, you know what, it's all of our fault. It's all of our fault, and we can all be part of the solution. You know, so much of the racism, of the nationalism, of the classism in our world comes from the fact that we do not acknowledge that the line dividing good and evil runs through every human heart. Look what happened to Paul. Paul was a Jewish Pharisee. What does that mean? It means that there were huge groups of people in the world that he despised Gentiles, namely, right? Most of the rest of humanity, he wanted nothing to do with them. He looked down upon them. He thought they were the scum of the earth. Look what Paul says in verse 9. He says this, what are we to conclude? Are we any better? And his answer is no, not at all. He began to sense, hang on a second, if sin runs this deep within every human heart, who am I to feel superior to anybody else? And he gave the rest of his life to share the good news of Jesus among Gentiles, to live with Gentiles. The human race was rehumanized to Paul because he believed in the doctrine of original sin. And you see, for us as Christians, gosh, is this relevant for us? If you're going to share your faith with somebody who does not believe in the same way that you do, think about how many people have been turned off by Christians who feel like they are superior. Christians who come off as judgmental and arrogant, thinking, I know what's right about God, but you don't. You need what I have. Now, there may be some truth in the sense that you think, yeah, you need Jesus just the same way that I need Jesus. But every Christian ought to realize the fact that as we are witnessing to those who do not yet believe, we are no better. Why? Because we know that we're not saved because we're better. Our gospel is that we're saved because of grace. Think about how much better the world would be if we actually believed this doctrine of original sin, that none of us are any better than anyone else, the breadth of human sin. And yet even still, maybe you hear that and we think, okay, yes, I can acknowledge that people are pretty broken. I can even acknowledge that I'm pretty broken, pretty turned in upon myself, pretty selfish. I can acknowledge and I can admit that. But have you ever asked this question before? If people aren't really as messed up and as broken as Paul is saying that they are, why would God still judge us? Why would he still condemn us, given the fact that, everybody is this broken, everybody is this messed up? Why wouldn't God be just a little bit more forgiving, a little bit more tolerant, given the fact that this is true of the entire human race? I think it's a fair question. But when you ask that question, it's because, thirdly, you're missing the direction of sin. The direction of sin. Paul speaks of the direction of our sin. Listen to this. Paul says that every human being, he says, has turned away from God. He says there's no one who seeks after God. All have turned away. Do you hear those two words, seek and turn away? Those are both directional words, aren't they? You see, what Paul is saying is that our sin, before sin is ever a behavioral matter, it's always first a relational matter. He says that the essence of our sin is wanting to turn away from God, wanting to get away from God. We've talked about this a few weeks ago, that we all want to be our own God. We want to run our own life. We want to feel like we are our own Savior and Master and Lord. And so we want to get out from under God's gaze. We want to get out from under his hand. We want to get away from God. Sin at its essence, it's a relational matter. It's not about so much just doing good or bad things. It's about why we do whatever it is we're doing. And Paul is saying that apart from Jesus' redeeming work in our life, we're always trying to get away from God. It's directional. It's relational. And you can do that in a couple of ways. We've talked about that. You can try to get away from God by saying, look, I'm going to be a law unto myself. I'm going to live for my own pleasure however I want, ignoring God. Or you can be a very moral person. You can be a very religious person who says, I'm going to do all the good things because then God's going to be in my debt. And he's going to owe me and have to give me the blessings and things that I want. In which case you want things from God, but you don't actually want God. Right? We're running from God, trying to get away from God. That's the nature of sin. And so, in many ways, God's just judgment for that is to say, here you go. We said that a few weeks ago. We said that's God's justice. He gives us what we want, but that is hell. That is misery. Because we were made for a relationship with God. God is the source of all that is good. So if you run away from God, you're cutting yourself off from the very source of goodness. You're cutting yourself off from the very source of life. That's what Jesus experienced on the cross, as he experienced God turning away from him, as he bore our sin on the cross. He was cut off from God's presence. That is hell. But it's very just. Because of the directional nature of sin, God is giving us over to the very thing that we want, which is life apart from him. So what do we do? What's the right response to this reality of sin that Paul is laying out in front of us? And this is the last point that Paul makes and that I want to make. What is the right response to our sin? Look at what Paul says in verse 19. Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. Now, what's Paul saying here? Well, in a moment, right, Paul is he's gonna shift gears. He's going to talk about the good news of the gospel, and he's going to say, but now a righteousness from God, apart from the works of the law, has been revealed in Jesus Christ. He's about to share this incredible good news of how God has rescued and saved us as a gift of grace. But what Paul is saying here is that before you're able to really embrace this righteousness that is received, you first have to abandon any hope of a righteousness that is achieved, a righteousness that we earn or deserve. He says every mouth must be stopped, silenced before God. Let me end with this practically. What does it mean to shut your mouth before God? It means that we stop making excuses for the sin in our lives. You know, we always love to say, yes, I shouldn't have done that, but I was really hungry, but I've been really stressed, but, if you hadn't done this first, but God, if you hadn't put me in these circumstances, then I wouldn't have done that. We want to make excuses. To shut our mouths is to say, God, I'm not going to make excuses. To shut our mouths before God means we stop pretending that we can fix ourselves. So instead of saying, God, I know I messed up, but I can do better next time. If you'll just let me try, I know I can do better than that. No, we say, you know what? I can't fix myself. I can't save myself. Only you are able to do that for me. And here's the hardest of all. To shut our mouths means that we stop pleading our own goodness. Instead of saying, God, I know I've done some things wrong, but look at all the good things that I've done. And surely we have done some very good things as well. But to shut our mouths is to say, God, I recognize even the good things that I've done have often been tainted with so much self-interest, with so little real love for you or love for other people. To shut our mouths before God means that we stop pleading our own goodness and we accept the righteousness of his just judgment toward our sin. But can I tell you, when you do that, you open yourself up to receiving God's grace. Because now your good deeds no longer get between you and God. You can open your hands and you can simply say, God, all I have is my need. But I see what you have done for me. Graciously to forgive me and to accept me in your Son, Jesus Christ. Paul says no one seeks after God. But the great news of the gospel is that we worship a God who seeks after us. And that's what we sang about just a moment ago, isn't it? You keep coming after me. And whether you are seeing that for the first time, you're seeing that for the 10,000th time, every time you acknowledge that we do not seek him, but that he is seeking and pursuing us, you open yourself up to receive that grace. As he comes after you, my sin cannot outrun the fury of your grace, we sang a moment ago. He is a God who seeks after us. He left his home in heaven. He was willing to go to a cross. He was willing to suffer and to die so that we could be brought into God's home, God's family forever. He is a God who seeks after us at infinite cost to himself. And that's what we celebrate when we come to the Lord's table together. So let's pray as we come to this table. Our Heavenly Father, we admit with Blaise Pascal that it is a rude jolt to any of us to own and acknowledge the depth and the reality of the evil and sin that resides within each of our hearts. God, we struggle to believe this doctrine for ourselves, much less to be able to explain and articulate it to those who don't share our beliefs. But I pray, God, that through the convicting work of your Spirit, even this morning, that you would help us to honestly be able to own and acknowledge that we have no case to make before your seat of judgment. I pray that every mouth in this room would be stopped, silenced, even for the first time today. That instead of pleading our own goodness, we would receive the righteousness that you graciously extend to us in your Son, Jesus Christ, and that as we do, we would be humbled so that we would not think ourselves better than anyone else, so that we would have wisdom to understand our own brokenness and that in the world around us, so that our hearts might fundamentally even be changed, so that seeing the way, God, that you have sought us, that we in turn would want to seek after you. We come to you this morning with our need and receive your grace. In Jesus' name, amen. Friends, on the night that our Lord Jesus was betrayed,